Tonight, we journey to the windswept cliffs above the Dead Sea, where shepherds once stumbled upon caves filled with ancient secrets. But this isn't just a story about discovery. It's about what happened after those parchments emerged from 2,000 years of darkness. Who decided which fragments would see the light of day? Which scholars would control access to humanity's oldest biblical manuscripts? And most unsettling of all, why did it take nearly half a century for the world to see what was hidden in those caves? Welcome to History for Sleep, where we explore the mysteries that textbooks prefer to leave in shadows. I'm your guide through the quiet corridors of forgotten knowledge, and tonight we're uncovering one of the most controversial archaeological stories of the modern era. So settle in, close your eyes, and let me tell you about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the men who decided their fate. The year was 1947. A young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Dib was searching for a lost goat among the limestone cliffs of Qumran, 15 miles east of Jerusalem. As the story goes, he threw a stone into a cave opening and heard the unexpected sound of pottery breaking. What he found when he climbed inside would shake the foundations of biblical scholarship forever. Scattered across the cave floor were clay jars containing leather and papyrus scrolls wrapped in linen cloth. The parchments were covered in Hebrew text, written in scripts so ancient they seemed to whisper from another world entirely. But this shepherd boy had no idea he had just made what many consider the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. Within months, word of the find reached antiquities dealers in Bethlehem and Jerusalem. The scrolls began changing hands in a shadowy marketplace where ancient manuscripts were bought and sold like precious stones. Some fragments were purchased by the Syrian Orthodox Metropolitan Samuel for what would today be a few $100s. Others found their way to Professor Eliezer Sukenik at Hebrew University, who immediately recognized their extraordinary significance. But from the very beginning, something was wrong. Access to these ancient texts was being controlled by a small circle of scholars, dealers, and religious authorities. The scrolls weren't going to museums or universities where they could be studied openly. Instead, they were disappearing into private collections and restricted archives, creating a bottleneck that would strangle scholarship for decades. By 1948, as the First Arab-Israeli War erupted around the discovery site, the Metropolitan Samuel had traveled to the United States, carrying 4 of the most complete scrolls in a suitcase. He placed an advertisement in the Wall Street Journal, offering them for sale. The ad read simply, "The 4 Dead Sea Scrolls. Biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. An ideal gift. As if 2,000-year-old biblical manuscripts were trinkets to be passed around at dinner parties." The scrolls were eventually purchased by Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin for $250,000. But the precedent had been set. These weren't just archaeological artifacts to be studied and shared with the world. They were commodities to be controlled, hoarded, and used as bargaining chips in a game most people didn't even know was being played. Meanwhile, back in the Judean desert, more caves were being discovered. Cave 2, Cave 3, Cave 4. Each one yielded more fragments, more secrets, more pieces of a puzzle that was becoming almost impossibly complex. Cave 4 alone contained the remains of nearly 600 manuscripts, but they weren't complete scrolls like those first discoveries. They were fragments, thousands upon thousands of pieces, some no larger than postage stamps, covered in ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek text. It was like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle where most of the pieces were missing. Many of the remaining pieces were damaged beyond recognition, and no one was quite sure what the final picture was supposed to look like. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that access to these fragments was being restricted to an ever-shrinking circle of scholars. In 1952, an international team was assembled to study the Cave 4 fragments. It was led by Father Roland Deveau, a French Dominican priest and archaeologist, who became the de facto gatekeeper of Dead Sea Scroll scholarship. The team included just 8 scholars, mostly Christian, mostly European, or American. They were given exclusive access to photograph, transcribe, and publish the fragments. Everyone else in the world would have to wait. This is where our story takes a darker turn. Because what should have been a triumph of archaeological discovery and international cooperation became something else entirely. It became a decades-long exercise in academic control that kept some of humanity's oldest biblical manuscripts locked away from the very scholars who were best equipped to study them. The team members divided the fragments among themselves like pieces of territory. Each scholar was assigned certain texts and given absolute authority over when and how they would be published. There were no deadlines, no oversight, no accountability. If a scholar wanted to sit on fragments for 10 years, 20 years, or even longer, that was their prerogative, and sit on them they did. By the 1960s, only a handful of the major texts had been published. The Community Rule, the War Scroll, the Thanksgiving Hymns, these were the manuscripts that captured public imagination and made headlines around the world. But the vast majority of the material remained locked away in a climate-controlled room at the Palestine Archaeological Museum in Jerusalem, accessible only to the 8 members of the international team. Other scholars began to grow frustrated. They submitted requests to see photographs of the fragments, to examine the original materials, to participate in the research. They were politely but firmly refused. The team maintained that the work was too delicate, too complex, too important to be shared with anyone who might misinterpret or mishandle the materials. But whispers began to spread through the academic world. Why was it taking so long? What were they finding in those caves that couldn't be shared with other scholars? And most troubling of all, were there religious or political reasons why certain texts were being kept from public view? The fragments from Cave 4 contained biblical texts that were older than anything previously known. They included books of the Hebrew Bible copied centuries before the standardized texts that became the foundation of modern Judaism and Christianity. Some of these ancient versions contained variations, different wordings, even different stories than what appeared in later manuscripts. For conservative religious scholars, this presented a problem. If these were indeed the oldest known copies of biblical texts, and if they differed from later versions, what did that say about the reliability of Scripture? Had the biblical text been altered over the centuries? Were there multiple traditions, multiple versions of what many considered to be the unchanging Word of God? Some critics began to suggest that the delays in publication weren't just about scholarly caution, they were about protecting religious orthodoxy. The international team, dominated by Christian scholars with close ties to religious institutions, had a vested interest in controlling how these potentially controversial texts were presented to the world. Father DeVoe himself was not just an archaeologist, but a priest whose faith depended on certain assumptions about biblical authority and reliability. How objective could he be when evaluating texts that might challenge those very assumptions? And what about the other team members, many of whom held positions at religious universities or seminaries? The situation was made even more complex by the political realities of the region. The scrolls had been discovered in territory that was controlled by Jordan after the 1948 war, but the Palestine Archaeological Museum, where they were housed, was an international institution with a British mandate. After the 1967 Six-Day War, the territory came under Israeli control, adding another layer of political sensitivity to an already complicated situation. Israeli scholars, many of whom were Jewish, found themselves largely excluded from research on texts that had been discovered in what was now Israeli territory and which contained some of the oldest Hebrew manuscripts ever found. Meanwhile, the international team continued to operate much as it had before, as if nothing had changed. Dr. Geza Vermes, a Hungarian-born Jewish scholar who had converted to Christianity and later returned to Judaism, became one of the most vocal critics of the team's exclusionary practices. He had been trying to gain access to unpublished fragments for years, particularly those related to Jewish sectarian literature that fell within his area of expertise. In letter after letter, Vermes pleaded with team members to share their materials, or at least to provide information about what they contained. He was repeatedly told that the work was too preliminary, too uncertain, too incomplete to be shared. But as the years passed and publication continued to lag, Vermes began to suspect that something else was at play. Other scholars joined the chorus of criticism. Professor Morton Smith of Columbia University accused the team of creating an academic scandal by hoarding materials that belonged to all of humanity. Dr. Philip Davies of the University of Sheffield suggested that the delays were motivated by a desire to protect Christian interpretations of early Judaism. But perhaps the most damaging criticism came from within the scholarly establishment itself. In 1977, Biblical Archaeology review editor Herschel Shanks published a scathing editorial titled "The Shame of the Dead Sea Scrolls." He accused the international team of creating a monopoly over ancient texts and called for immediate release of all unpublished materials. The team's response was defensive and dismissive. They insisted that their work was proceeding as quickly as possible, given the complexity of the materials. They pointed out that many of the fragments were badly damaged, that the handwriting was often difficult to decipher, and that proper scholarly analysis took time. But critics noted that other ancient manuscript discoveries had been published much more quickly. The Nag Hammadi codices, discovered in Egypt in 1945, had been fully published within 30 years, despite being equally complex and fragmentary. The Chester Beatty papyri, the Bodmer papyri, numerous other archaeological finds had all been made available to scholars in a fraction of the time it was taking to publish the Dead Sea Scrolls. Something was clearly wrong with the system that had been established at Qumran. But what exactly was being hidden, and why? As the 1980s dawned, pressure continued to mount on the international team. New voices joined the criticism, including some from unexpected quarters. Rabbi Norman Lamb, president of Yeshiva University, accused the team of academic anti-Semitism for excluding Jewish scholars from research on Jewish texts. Professor James Sanders of the Claremont School of Theology, himself a Christian scholar, called the situation unconscionable and demanded immediate reform. The team members began to show signs of strain. Some defended their work more aggressively, insisting that criticism was unfounded and motivated by jealousy or political bias. Others became more reclusive, avoiding conferences and declining interviews. A few began to acknowledge privately that perhaps the process had taken longer than originally anticipated. But still, the fragments remained locked away. Still, the photographs were restricted. Still, scholars around the world were forced to work with incomplete information, trying to piece together the significance of discoveries they were not allowed to see. What made the situation even more frustrating was that rumors continued to circulate about what the unpublished texts contained. Some suggested there were early Christian documents that would revolutionize understanding of Jesus and the origins of Christianity. Others claimed there were Jewish sectarian texts that would challenge traditional views of ancient Judaism. One particularly persistent rumor concerned a text that supposedly contained a different version of the crucifixion story, one that might call into question fundamental Christian beliefs about the death and resurrection of Jesus. Another involved fragments that allegedly showed connections between the Qumran community and early Christian movements, suggesting that Christianity had emerged from a specific Jewish sect rather than representing an entirely new revelation. These rumors were never confirmed or denied by the international team. Their silence only fueled more speculation and more criticism. If the texts contained nothing controversial, critics asked, why not publish them immediately and put the rumors to rest? If they did contain controversial material, didn't the scholarly community and the public have a right to know? By the mid-1980s, the situation had reached a crisis point. Several of the original team members had died, taking their assigned fragments with them to the grave. Others were aging and showed little sign of completing their work before they too would be unable to continue. Father DeVoe had died in 1971, But his successor, Father Pierre Benoit, maintained the same restrictive policies. The fragments remained locked away, photographs remained restricted, and access remained limited to the dwindling circle of original team members and their hand-picked successors. It was becoming clear that if something didn't change soon, some of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century might never be properly studied or published. The texts that had survived 2,000 years in desert caves were now in danger of being lost again, not to the elements or to war, but to human stubbornness and institutional inertia. But change was coming, whether the international team was ready for it or not. New technologies were making it easier to copy and distribute ancient texts. New scholars were refusing to accept the old restrictions, and most importantly, new questions were being asked about who really owned these ancient manuscripts and who had the right to control access to them. The Dead Sea Scrolls belonged to all of humanity, critics argued. They were too important, too significant, too revelatory to be hoarded by a small group of scholars, no matter how well-intentioned they might be. The time had come to break the monopoly and open the caves once again. But as we'll discover, the forces that had kept these texts hidden for so long would not give up their control without a fight. The battle for the Dead Sea Scrolls was about to enter its most dramatic phase. But to understand what happened next, we need to step back and examine the personalities behind this decades-long controversy. Because this wasn't just about ancient manuscripts or scholarly methodology. It was about power, ego, and the very human tendency to guard secrets, even when those secrets might change the world. John Strugnell was perhaps the most enigmatic figure in the entire saga. A British scholar who had joined the international team as a young graduate student in 1954, he had spent more than 3 decades working with the Cave 4 fragments. By the 1980s, he had become the chief editor of the Scrolls Project, inheriting the mantle of authority from the deceased Father Devoe. Strugnell was brilliant. There was no question about that. His knowledge of ancient Hebrew and Aramaic was encyclopedic. His ability to decipher damaged and fragmentary texts was legendary among his peers. But he was also secretive, paranoid, and increasingly isolated from the broader scholarly community. Those who knew him described a man obsessed with perfection, unwilling to publish anything until he was absolutely certain of every translation, every interpretation, every possible meaning. He would spend years working on a single fragment, comparing it with other texts, researching historical contexts, building elaborate theories about its significance. And then, just when colleagues expected him to publish his findings, he would discover some new angle, some fresh perspective that required starting the entire process over again. But there were whispers that Strugnell's delays weren't entirely about scholarly perfectionism. Some suggested he had become possessive of the texts, viewing them as his personal property rather than archaeological artifacts belonging to humanity. Others claimed he was deliberately withholding materials that might contradict his own religious beliefs or academic theories. The truth, as it often is, was probably more complex than either explanation. Strugnell had devoted his entire career to these fragments. They had become his life's work, his identity, his reason for existing. The thought of releasing them to other scholars who might interpret them differently, who might challenge his conclusions or find errors in his work, was apparently unbearable. Meanwhile, other members of the original team were facing their own struggles with the material. Frank Moore-Cross of Harvard University had been assigned some of the most important biblical texts from Cave 4, including fragments of Samuel and Kings that were centuries older than any previously known manuscripts. His work was meticulous and groundbreaking, but it was also painfully slow. Cross faced a particular dilemma that illustrated the complexity of the entire project. The biblical fragments he was studying contained variations from the standard Hebrew text that had been used for centuries. Some of these variations were minor, simple differences in spelling or grammar, but others were more significant, involving different wordings, additional verses, or even completely different versions of familiar stories. For a scholar working at a time when biblical criticism was already controversial in many religious circles, these discoveries presented a minefield of potential problems. If he published his findings too quickly or without sufficient context, they might be misinterpreted by the media or exploited by those seeking to undermine religious faith. But if he delayed publication indefinitely, he would be accused of suppressing important evidence about the development of biblical texts. Cross chose caution over speed, spending decades preparing detailed studies that would place his discoveries in proper historical and literary context. His work was eventually published and proved to be invaluable for understanding how biblical texts were transmitted and preserved in ancient times. But the delay meant that other scholars were unable to build on his research or challenge his conclusions for far too long. Similar dilemmas faced other team members. Joseph Milik, a Polish priest and scholar, had been assigned a vast collection of fragmentary texts, including calendrical documents, liturgical works, and sectarian literature. His expertise in ancient languages was unmatched, but his productivity was frustratingly slow. Year after year, he would announce that his publications were nearly ready, only to disappear back into his research for months or years at a time. Patrick Scahan, an American Catholic priest and biblical scholar, had been given responsibility for some of the most complete biblical manuscripts from the caves. His work was careful and thorough, but he too seemed reluctant to release his materials to the broader scholarly community. When he died in 1980, many of his assigned texts were still unpublished, and his notes were scattered and incomplete. The pattern was becoming clear. Each scholar on the international team had valid reasons for their delays, but collectively, their caution was creating a crisis for the entire field of Dead Sea Scroll studies. Younger scholars were unable to begin their careers working with these materials. Established researchers were forced to work with incomplete information, and the general public remained largely ignorant of discoveries that might revolutionize understanding of ancient Judaism and early Christianity. But the most troubling aspect of the situation wasn't the delays themselves. It was the growing suspicion that some team members were actively suppressing materials that might prove controversial or embarrassing to their religious institutions. This suspicion was fueled by occasional leaks and rumors about what the unpublished texts contained. In 1985, a scholar who had briefly worked with the team claimed that there were fragments describing a Messiah figure who had been crucified, potentially predating Jesus by decades. The claim was quickly denied by team members, but they refused to publish the texts in question or allow other scholars to examine them. Another rumor concerned a document that supposedly contained harsh criticisms of the Jerusalem temple and its priesthood, written by members of the Qumran community. If authentic, such a text would provide valuable insights into the religious and political tensions of first-century Palestine. But again, the rumor could neither be confirmed nor denied because the relevant fragments remained unpublished. Perhaps most damaging of all were suggestions that some texts contained evidence of diversity within early Judaism that would challenge traditional assumptions about religious orthodoxy. If the Qumran community represented just one of many Jewish sects with different beliefs, practices, and interpretations of Scripture, what did that say about claims of religious authority and continuity? These questions weren't just academic. They had real implications for how millions of people understood their faith, their history, and their relationship to ancient traditions. But as long as the texts remained locked away, the questions could neither be answered nor properly addressed. The international team's response to these criticisms was increasingly defensive and hostile. They accused their critics of sensationalism, of seeking publicity rather than scholarly truth, of being motivated by anti-religious bias or political agenda. They insisted that their work was proceeding as quickly as possible, given the complexity of the materials and the need for absolute accuracy, but their explanations were becoming harder to believe. Other ancient manuscript projects had been completed much more quickly. New technologies were making it easier to photograph, transcribe, and distribute texts. And most importantly, The scholarly community had developed new methods for collaborative research that could accelerate the publication process without sacrificing quality. The team's isolation was becoming self-reinforcing. The more they were criticized, the more defensive they became. The more defensive they became, the more they restricted access to their materials. And the more they restricted access, the more suspicion and criticism they generated. By the late 1980s, the situation had reached a breaking point. Several prominent scholars had begun calling for the intervention of government authorities or international organizations. Others suggested that the scrolls should be removed from the team's control and placed in public institutions where they could be studied openly. The pressure was particularly intense from Israeli scholars, who argued that texts discovered in Israeli territory should be accessible to Israeli researchers. Dr. Emmanuel Tov of Hebrew University had been trying for years to gain access to certain fragments that fell within his area of expertise. His requests were consistently denied, often without explanation. Tov's frustration was shared by many other scholars around the world. Professor Gezer Vermes, who had been fighting for access since the 1960s, published increasingly sharp criticisms of the team's monopolistic practices. Dr. Norman Golb of the University of Chicago argued that the delays were preventing proper evaluation of competing theories about the origin and significance of the scrolls. But perhaps the most effective critic was Herschel Shanks, the editor of Biblical Archaeology Review. Shanks had access to a popular magazine with thousands of subscribers, and he used it to wage a sustained campaign against what he called the scandal of the unpublished scrolls. In article after article, Shanks exposed the contradictions and delays in the Scrolls project. He interviewed frustrated scholars, published leaked information about unpublished texts, and consistently challenged the team's explanations for their slow progress. His magazine became a forum for critics of the international team and a rallying point for those demanding reform. The team's response to Shanks was particularly revealing. Rather than addressing his criticisms directly or providing better explanations for their delays, they attempted to discredit him personally. They suggested he was a journalist rather than a scholar, implying that he lacked the expertise to evaluate their work. They accused him of sensationalism and of damaging the reputation of serious scholarship. But Shanks refused to be intimidated. If anything, the personal attacks only strengthened his resolve to expose what he saw as an unconscionable monopoly over humanity's heritage. He began to investigate not just the delays in publication, but the entire system that had allowed such delays to occur. What Shanks discovered was a web of institutional relationships and personal loyalties that had protected the international team from outside oversight for decades. The Palestine Archaeological Museum, where the scrolls were housed, was governed by an international board that included several supporters of the team's approach. The scholarly journals where scroll research was published were often edited by colleagues or friends of team members. Even more troubling, Shanks found evidence that some institutions had financial interests in maintaining the status quo. The exclusive access granted to team members made their research more valuable and their expertise more sought after. Universities competed to hire scholars who had access to unpublished materials. Publishers paid premium prices for books based on exclusive information. The Dead Sea Scrolls had become not just archaeological artifacts, but commodities in an academic marketplace where scarcity increased value and exclusivity enhanced prestige. The longer the texts remained unpublished, the more valuable they became to those who controlled access to them. This economic dimension of the controversy was rarely discussed openly, but it provided a powerful incentive for maintaining the existing system. Team members had built their careers on exclusive access to these materials. Their positions, their reputations, their livelihood depended on remaining gatekeepers to ancient secrets. But by 1990, the pressure for change had become irresistible. New players were entering the game, armed with new technologies and unwilling to accept the old restrictions. The monopoly that had lasted for nearly 4 decades was about to be broken in ways that no one could have predicted. The revolution began not with scholarly protests or institutional pressure, but with a simple act of technological innovation. And when it came, it would sweep away the careful controls that had kept these ancient voices silent for so long. The scrolls were about to speak again, but this time their words would not be filtered through the careful interpretations of a chosen few. They would speak directly to anyone with the courage to listen. The revolution that would finally break open the Dead Sea Scrolls began in the most unlikely of places, a photography studio in California. In 1988, a team of researchers at the Ancient Biblical Manuscripts Center in Claremont had been quietly working on a project that would change everything. They had been using advanced photographic techniques to create high-resolution images of ancient manuscripts, initially focusing on other collections that were freely available to scholars. But Dr. James Sanders, the center's director, had a different idea. What if they could somehow obtain photographs of the unpublished Dead Sea Scroll fragments? What if they could bypass the international team's stranglehold on access by working with images rather than original materials? The opportunity came through an unexpected source. A former member of the international team, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the delays and restrictions, quietly approached Sanders with a proposal. This scholar, whose identity remains protected even today, had retained personal copies of photographs taken during his years working on the project. These weren't official publication quality images, but they were clear enough to allow serious scholarly work. The ethical implications were staggering. These photographs had been taken under agreements that restricted their use to team members only. Sharing them with outside scholars would violate decades of carefully negotiated protocols. It would almost certainly end any possibility of the whistleblower continuing to work with official materials. But the scholar had reached a breaking point. He had watched colleagues die while their assigned texts remained unpublished. He had seen important discoveries gathering dust, while the academic world remained ignorant of their existence. Most painfully, he had witnessed the transformation of what should have been humanity's shared heritage into a private preserve for a privileged few. The decision to share the photographs was not made lightly. Sanders and his colleagues understood that they were crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. Once these images became available to scholars outside the international team, the entire system of controlled access would begin to crumble. They decided to proceed, but carefully. Rather than releasing the photographs immediately to the general scholarly community, they began by sharing them with a small group of trusted researchers. Each scholar who received access was asked to sign agreements promising to use the materials responsibly and to respect the academic integrity of the work. The response was electric. Scholars who had been waiting decades for access to these materials suddenly found themselves able to work with texts they had only heard about in rumors and speculation. Dr. Michael Wise at the University of Chicago began working on previously unknown liturgical texts. Professor Lawrence Schiffman at New York University started analyzing legal documents that shed new light on ancient Jewish law. But the most dramatic breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. Robert Eisenman, a professor at California State University Long Beach, had been one of the most vocal critics of the international team's monopolistic practices. Unlike many of his colleagues, Eisenman wasn't primarily a biblical scholar or an expert in ancient languages. He was a historian of early Christianity who had become convinced that the Dead Sea Scrolls contained crucial information about the origins of the Christian movement. When Eisenman gained access to the bootleg photographs, he immediately began working on a text that had been rumored to exist for years but had never been published. Known by its catalogue number as 4Q285, this fragmentary document appeared to describe a messianic figure who would lead God's people in a final battle against evil. But what made this text explosive wasn't its messianic content. It was a single line that seemed to describe this Messiah figure being pierced or wounded. The Hebrew text was ambiguous, but one possible reading suggested that the Messiah would be killed, not triumphant. If authentic, and if Eisenman's interpretation was correct, this text would predate Jesus by decades and would suggest that the idea of a suffering Messiah was already present in Jewish thought before Christianity emerged. The implications for understanding the relationship between Judaism and Christianity were staggering. Eisenman's preliminary findings were published in Biblical Archaeology Review in 1991, causing an immediate sensation. Here, finally, was concrete evidence of what the unpublished scrolls might contain. Here was proof that the international team had been sitting on materials of extraordinary significance. The team's response was swift and harsh. They accused Eisenman of misinterpreting damaged and ambiguous texts. They questioned his qualifications to work with such complex materials. Most damagingly, they suggested that his interpretations were driven by sensationalism rather than serious scholarship. But their criticisms rang hollow because they refused to publish their own interpretations of the same texts. How could other scholars evaluate competing theories when only one side had access to the evidence? How could the academic community reach informed conclusions when the primary sources remained locked away? The controversy over 4Q285 became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the Scrolls publication project. Here was a text of potentially revolutionary significance, discovered more than 40 years earlier, still unpublished by its official editors, and now the subject of heated debate based on bootleg photographs and preliminary interpretations. Other scholars began coming forward with their own findings from the pirated images. Professor Martin Abegg at Grace College had been working with a team of graduate students to create computer concordances of the unpublished texts. Their work revealed the scope and diversity of the Cave 4 collection in ways that the public had never understood. There were biblical texts in versions that differed significantly from later standard editions. There were sectarian documents that revealed the complex theology and social organization of the Qumran community. There were calendrical texts, liturgical works, legal documents, and wisdom literature that painted a picture of ancient Judaism far more diverse and dynamic than traditional scholarship had assumed. Most intriguingly, there were texts that seemed to bridge the gap between Judaism and Christianity in unexpected ways. Not because they were Christian documents, but because they showed that many ideas later associated with Christianity were already present in certain Jewish circles before Jesus was born. The Temple Scroll, one of the longest and most complete documents from the caves, contained a vision of an idealized temple that would be built in the Messianic age. The community rule described a sectarian group that practiced communal ownership of property, ritual baptism, and sacred meals that bore striking resemblances to early Christian practices. These parallels didn't prove that Christianity derived directly from the Qumran community, but they did suggest that the religious world of first-century Palestine was far more complex than either Jewish or Christian traditional accounts acknowledged. They showed that the emergence of Christianity took place within a context of diverse Jewish movements, each with their own interpretations of Scripture, their own expectations about the future, and their own practices of religious life. For scholars of early Christianity, these discoveries were revolutionary. They provided new context for understanding the teachings of Jesus, the development of Christian theology, and the relationship between the early church and its Jewish origins. But they also raised troubling questions about traditional claims of Christian uniqueness and divine revelation. For Jewish scholars, the scrolls were equally significant, but in different ways. They revealed the diversity of ancient Jewish thought and practice, showing that there was no single Orthodox Judaism in the Second Temple period. They provided new evidence about the development of Jewish law, the interpretation of biblical texts, and the variety of Jewish responses to foreign domination and internal religious conflict. But perhaps most importantly for both communities, the scrolls demonstrated that the boundaries between Judaism and Christianity in the first century were far more fluid than later religious developments would suggest. They showed two religious traditions that shared common roots, common texts, and common concerns, even as they developed in different directions. This evidence was precisely what many religious authorities found most threatening about the scrolls. If Judaism and Christianity were more closely related in their origins than traditional accounts suggested, what did that mean for claims of religious authority and exclusive truth? If there were multiple legitimate interpretations of biblical texts and multiple valid approaches to Jewish religious life, how could any single institution claim to represent the one true faith? These weren't just academic questions. They had real implications for millions of believers whose understanding of their own religious identity was bound up with traditional accounts of their faith's origins and development. The longer the scrolls remained unpublished, the longer these questions could be avoided or controlled. But by 1991, avoidance was no longer possible. The bootleg photographs were circulating more widely. Preliminary studies were being published in popular magazines and scholarly journals. The international team's monopoly was crumbling, and with it, their ability to control how the scrolls were interpreted and understood. The crisis deepened when Herschel Shanks made a dramatic announcement. Biblical Archaeology Review had obtained a complete set of photographs of all the unpublished Cave 4 fragments. They had been provided by someone with legitimate access to the materials, someone who had grown tired of waiting for official publication. Shanks didn't reveal his source, but he made it clear that the photographs would be made available to any qualified scholar who requested them. The international team's exclusive access was about to become irrelevant. The response from team members and their institutional supporters was immediate and fierce. They threatened legal action to prevent distribution of the photographs. They argued that Shanks was violating copyright agreements and endangering the integrity of ongoing research. They claimed that premature publication of fragmentary and ambiguous texts would lead to misinterpretation and sensationalism, but their protests carried less weight than they once had. Too many scholars had been waiting too long for access to these materials. Too many important discoveries had been delayed by bureaucratic inertia and personal ego. The academic community was ready for change, even if it came through irregular channels. The legal threats proved toothless. The photographs had been taken decades earlier by scholars working on publicly funded projects. Copyright claims were murky at best, and the public interest in making these materials available was overwhelming. More importantly, the scrolls themselves were ancient texts that belonged to all humanity, not private property that could be controlled indefinitely by a small group of academics. In November 1991, the Biblical Archaeology Review published a special issue containing photographs and preliminary transcriptions of dozens of previously unpublished scroll fragments. The issue sold out immediately and had to be reprinted multiple times. Scholars around the world finally had access to materials they had been seeking for decades. But the real breakthrough came a few months later when the Huntington Library in California made an even more dramatic announcement. They possessed a complete photographic archive of all the Dead Sea Scroll materials, and they were opening it to any scholar who requested access. The Huntington's collection had been acquired years earlier through legitimate channels, but the library had agreed to restrict access in deference to the international team's publication plans. Now, faced with growing criticism of those delays and increasing evidence that important research was being stifled, the library's directors decided to open their doors. Dr. William Moffett, the Huntington's director, explained the decision in terms that captured the frustration felt by many in the scholarly community. There is no compelling reason to deny access to materials of such obvious importance to the international community of scholars. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the heritage of all mankind. The international team's response was predictable but futile. They denounced the Huntington's decision as irresponsible and destructive to scholarship. They threatened to withdraw cooperation from any scholar who used the library's materials. They warned that premature access to unpublished fragments would lead to chaos in scroll studies, but their warnings fell on deaf ears. Within weeks of the Huntington's announcement, scholars from around the world were making pilgrimages to Pasadena, California, to see materials they had only dreamed of accessing. The reading room was booked solid for months in advance. Research projects that had been stalled for decades suddenly sprang to life. The floodgates had opened, and there was no closing them again. The 40-year monopoly on the Dead Sea Scrolls was finally broken, but breaking the monopoly was only the beginning. Now came the real work of understanding what these ancient voices had been trying to tell us all along. And as scholars began to examine the full scope of the collection with fresh eyes and new perspectives, they discovered that the reality was both more complex and more fascinating than anyone had imagined. The scrolls weren't just biblical manuscripts or sectarian documents. They were a window into a lost world. A world where religious boundaries were fluid, where sacred texts were living documents subject to interpretation and revision, and where the questions that still trouble believers today were being debated with passion and sophistication 2,000 years ago. That world was about to speak again, and this time everyone would be able to listen. What emerged from the newly opened archives was more extraordinary than even the most optimistic scholars had dared to hope. The scrolls weren't just ancient manuscripts, they were fragments of a lost civilization's deepest thoughts, their struggles with faith, their debates about the nature of God and humanity, and their desperate attempts to understand their place in a world that seemed to be spinning toward apocalypse. Dr. Eugene Ulrich at the University of Notre Dame was among the first to grasp the full implications of what had been hidden for so long. As he examined the biblical manuscripts with fresh eyes, he realized that the texts challenged fundamental assumptions about how Scripture had been preserved and transmitted. These weren't just older copies of familiar texts. They were evidence of a time when the biblical canon was still fluid, when different communities possessed different versions of the same stories, and when scribes felt free to revise and expand the texts they were copying. The book of Jeremiah, for instance, existed in two dramatically different versions among the Qumran scrolls. One matched the traditional Hebrew text that had been preserved by later Jewish communities, but the other was significantly shorter, missing entire chapters, and arranged in a different order. Both versions appeared to be ancient and authentic, suggesting that there had never been a single, authoritative text of Jeremiah in antiquity. Similar variations appeared throughout the biblical collection. The Book of Samuel contained episodes not found in later manuscripts. The Psalms were arranged differently and included compositions that had been lost for 2 millennia. Even the Ten Commandments appeared in variant forms, with different wordings and slightly different emphases. For scholars who had spent their careers assuming that biblical texts had been carefully preserved without alteration, these discoveries were revolutionary. They suggested that the process of canonization, deciding which books belonged in Scripture and what their final form should be, had been far more complex and contested than traditional accounts acknowledged. But the biblical manuscripts were only part of the story. The sectarian documents from Qumran painted a picture of ancient Judaism that was startlingly different from what most people had imagined. This wasn't the monolithic religion of popular conception, but a diverse and often fractious collection of competing groups, each convinced that they alone possessed the correct interpretation of God's will. The Community Rule, one of the first sectarian texts to be published, described a group that had withdrawn from mainstream Jewish society to live in strict communal discipline. They shared all property in common, observed elaborate purity rituals, and believed that they were living in the final days before God's judgment would fall upon the world. Their meals were sacred ceremonies. Their calendar was different from the one used in Jerusalem, and their interpretation of biblical law was far more stringent than what most Jews practiced. But as more sectarian texts became available, an even more complex picture emerged. The War Scroll described an elaborate 40-year conflict between the sons of light and the sons of darkness that would culminate in God's ultimate victory over evil. The Thanksgiving hymns contained deeply personal prayers of gratitude and supplication that revealed the inner spiritual life of community members. The Damascus document outlined rules for Jews who remained in ordinary society while maintaining connection to the sectarian movement. Most intriguingly, there were texts that seemed to describe multiple Messiah figures, not just one Redeemer, but separate anointed leaders for different aspects of the coming kingdom. There would be a Messiah of Aaron, representing priestly authority, and a Messiah of Israel, representing royal power. Some texts even hinted at a third figure, a prophet like Moses who would teach the law in the final days. These complex messianic expectations provided crucial context for understanding the world into which Christianity emerged. They showed that first-century Jews had sophisticated and varied ideas about how God would redeem Israel. Ideas that went far beyond the simple expectation of a single royal Messiah that dominated later Jewish and Christian thinking. Dr. James Vanderkam at the University of Notre Dame spent years working through the calendrical texts from Qumran, and what he discovered was equally revolutionary. The community had used a solar calendar of 364 days rather than the lunar calendar observed in Jerusalem. This wasn't just a technical difference. It meant that the Qumran sectarians celebrated festivals on completely different days than other Jews, creating a fundamental rift in religious practice. The calendar controversy revealed deeper tensions about religious authority and the proper interpretation of biblical law. The Qumran community believed that the Jerusalem priesthood had corrupted not just the temple service, but time itself. By following the wrong calendar, they argued, the temple priests were offering sacrifices on the wrong days, celebrating festivals at incorrect times, and leading the entire nation into sin. This discovery helped explain why the sectarians had withdrawn from mainstream Jewish life. It wasn't just that they disagreed with certain practices or interpretations. They believed that participation in the corrupted religious system of Jerusalem would compromise their own salvation. Only by separating themselves completely could they maintain the purity necessary to survive God's coming judgment. But perhaps the most controversial discoveries concerned the relationship between the Qumran community and early Christianity. As scholars gained access to more texts, they began to notice striking parallels between sectarian practices and what was known about the first Christian communities. Both groups practiced ritual baptism, though they understood its significance differently. Both held sacred meals that involved bread and wine, though again with different theological interpretations. Both believed they were living in the final days before God's kingdom would be established on earth. Both developed complex organizational structures with designated leaders and specific roles for different members. Most significantly, both groups interpreted biblical prophecies as referring to recent or contemporary events. The Qumran sectarians believed that ancient predictions about Israel's restoration were being fulfilled in their own time through their community's existence. Early Christians made similar claims about Jesus and the emergence of the church. These parallels didn't mean that Christianity derived directly from the Qumran community. The differences were too significant for that simple explanation. But they did suggest that both movements emerged from the same rich soil of first-century Jewish expectation and interpretation. They showed that many ideas later considered uniquely Christian had actually been developing within certain Jewish circles for decades before Jesus appeared on the scene. Dr. Lawrence Schiffman at New York University became one of the leading experts on the legal texts from Qumran, and his work revealed yet another dimension of the community's complexity. The sectarians hadn't simply rejected Jewish law, they had developed their own elaborate legal system that was in many ways more stringent than what was practiced elsewhere. Their interpretation of Sabbath law, for instance, went far beyond what even the most conservative Jewish authorities required. They forbade not just work, but virtually any activity that might be construed as labor. Members couldn't assist animals in giving birth on the Sabbath, couldn't rescue someone who had fallen into water, couldn't even speak about ordinary business matters. Their purity laws were equally strict. They required multiple ritual baths for various forms of contamination, maintained elaborate separation between pure and impure members, and developed complex procedures for readmission after violations. They even regulated sexual behavior in ways that went beyond biblical requirements, apparently viewing physical intimacy as inherently defiling. But these strict interpretations weren't arbitrary. They reflected a deep theological conviction that the community was living in sacred time and space, that they were already participating in the heavenly realm while still on earth. Every action, every word, every thought had cosmic significance because they were preparing for God's imminent intervention in human history. This theological framework helped explain why the sectarians were willing to endure the hardships of desert life, why they submitted to such rigorous discipline, and why they maintained their separatist stance, even when it meant cutting themselves off from family and friends. They weren't just following rules, they were living out their understanding of what it meant to be God's chosen people in the final days. As scholars worked through more of the newly available texts, they began to appreciate the sophisticated intellectual culture that had flourished at Qumran. These weren't simple desert hermits or anti-intellectual fanatics. They were learned men who had mastered the complexities of biblical interpretation, legal reasoning, and theological speculation. Their biblical commentaries revealed detailed knowledge of Scripture and sophisticated methods for discovering hidden meanings in ancient texts. They used techniques that wouldn't have seemed out of place in later rabbinic schools or early Christian communities, finding prophetic significance in seemingly mundane details, connecting disparate passages through verbal links, and applying ancient prophecies to contemporary situations. Their astronomical and calendrical texts demonstrated mathematical sophistication and careful observation of celestial phenomena. They had calculated the movements of the sun and moon with remarkable precision, developed complex systems for correlating solar and lunar cycles, and created elaborate schemes for organizing time according to divine patterns. Most impressively, their theological writings showed deep engagement with fundamental questions about the nature of God, the problem of evil, the meaning of human existence, and the destiny of creation. These weren't simple answers to complex questions, but nuanced explorations of mysteries that had puzzled religious thinkers for centuries. The instruction on the two spirits embedded within the community rule presented a sophisticated dualistic theology that explained the coexistence of good and evil in the world. God had created two spirits, one of light and one of darkness, that were locked in cosmic battle until the end of time. Every human being was influenced by both spirits, though in different proportions, and the struggle between them determined individual moral choices and ultimate destiny. This theological framework provided a compelling explanation for the moral complexities that troubled ancient believers just as they trouble modern ones. Why do good people suffer while evil people prosper? Why is it so difficult to do what is right? Why does the world seem to be getting worse rather than better? The two spirits doctrine offered answers that were both intellectually satisfying and practically applicable, but it also raised troubling questions about divine justice and human responsibility. If people were predetermined to be influenced more by one spirit than the other, how could they be held accountable for their actions? If God had created both good and evil, how could he be considered perfectly righteous? If the cosmic battle was already predetermined to end in light's victory, why did it continue for so long? The Qumran theologians wrestled with these questions in ways that revealed both their intellectual sophistication and their deep spiritual commitment. They weren't content with simple answers or easy solutions. They were willing to live with mystery and paradox while maintaining their fundamental faith in God's ultimate justice and mercy. Dr. Deborah Dimant at the University of Haifa became one of the leading experts on the wisdom literature from Qumran, and her work revealed yet another facet of the community's intellectual life. The sectarians had collected and composed elaborate reflections on the meaning of existence, the nature of wisdom, and the proper conduct of life. Some of these texts were traditional wisdom compositions similar to biblical books like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. They offered practical advice about relationships, work, speech, and moral behavior. They reflected on the brevity of life, the inevitability of death, and the importance of living according to divine principles. But other wisdom texts were more distinctively sectarian, incorporating the community's special theology and eschatological expectations. They interpreted traditional wisdom themes through the lens of the two spirits doctrine, the solar calendar, and the belief in imminent divine judgment. They showed how even the most basic questions about daily life were transformed when viewed from the perspective of cosmic battle and approaching apocalypse. The most remarkable of these compositions was a text known as the Instruction, which survived in multiple copies and appeared to have been one of the community's foundational documents. It presented a systematic account of human nature, divine justice, and cosmic history that rivaled anything produced by contemporary philosophers or theologians. The Instruction began with the premise that God had created humanity with the capacity for both good and evil, but had provided clear guidance about which path to choose. Those who followed divine instruction would prosper and find peace, while those who rejected it would face judgment and destruction. But the text went beyond simple moral exhortation to explore the psychological and spiritual dynamics of moral choice. It described the internal struggle between competing impulses, the way that evil thoughts could gradually corrupt the heart, and the importance of constant vigilance against spiritual contamination. It offered practical strategies for maintaining purity of heart and mind, and warned about the subtle ways that the spirit of darkness could deceive even sincere believers. Most significantly, the Instruction placed individual moral choice within the context of cosmic history and divine purpose. Every decision mattered not just for personal salvation, but for the ultimate outcome of the battle between light and darkness. Every act of righteousness strengthened the forces of good, while every sin empowered the realm of evil. This perspective gave enormous weight to seemingly ordinary choices and elevated daily moral decisions to cosmic significance. It helped explain why the sectarians were willing to endure such rigorous discipline, and why they viewed deviation from community rules as not just personal failure, but betrayal of the divine cause. As more texts became available, and scholars had time to study them carefully, a picture emerged of a community that was far more complex and sophisticated than anyone had imagined. These weren't simple sectarians who had rejected mainstream Judaism out of spite or ignorance. They were serious religious thinkers who had developed alternative interpretations of Scripture, alternative approaches to religious practice, and alternative visions of Israel's destiny. Their disagreements with other Jews weren't trivial matters of ritual or custom, but fundamental questions about the nature of divine revelation, the meaning of history, and the proper response to foreign domination. They had concluded that the religious establishment in Jerusalem had compromised with evil, and that only by separating themselves completely could they maintain faithfulness to God's true will. But they hadn't withdrawn from the world out of indifference to its fate. On the contrary, they believed that their faithfulness was crucial for the world's salvation. They saw themselves as the righteous remnant whose prayers and obedience would tip the cosmic balance toward light and hasten the coming of God's kingdom. This sense of cosmic responsibility helps explain both the intensity of their commitment and the severity of their discipline. They weren't just trying to save their own souls, they were trying to save the world. Every prayer they offered, every law they observed, every temptation they resisted, was a blow struck against the forces of darkness that threatened to overwhelm creation. The newly available texts also revealed the community's complex relationship with the broader Jewish world. They hadn't simply rejected all contact with other Jews. They had maintained elaborate networks of communication and influence that extended far beyond their desert settlements. The Damascus document described communities of sectarian sympathizers who lived in towns and cities throughout Palestine while maintaining connection to the movement's teachings. These urban adherents followed modified versions of sectarian law, contributed financially to the community's support, and served as links between the desert settlements and the wider world. Other texts described elaborate procedures for receiving visitors, evaluating potential converts, and maintaining communication with distant communities. The sectarians had developed sophisticated systems for preserving their teachings, training new leaders, and spreading their influence without compromising their separatist principles. Most intriguingly, some texts hinted at connections with Jewish communities outside Palestine. There were references to members traveling to distant lands, to teachings being sent to foreign communities, and to support being received from Jews in Egypt, Babylon, and other diaspora locations. These hints suggested that the Qumran community wasn't an isolated sect, but part of a broader network of Jewish groups that shared similar theological perspectives and sectarian practices. The movement may have been far larger and more influential than the physical remains at Qumran would suggest. This possibility raised new questions about the relationship between the sectarians and other Jewish movements of the period. Were they connected to the Essenes described by ancient historians like Josephus and Philo? Did they influence or were they influenced by other sectarian groups mentioned in early Christian and Jewish sources? How extensive was their network, and how long did it survive? The answers to these questions remained elusive, partly because the texts themselves were often cryptic about contemporary events and figures, and partly because so much other evidence from the period had been lost. But the mere possibility that the sectarians had been more influential than previously thought added new dimensions to understanding both ancient Judaism and early Christianity. If sectarian ideas had circulated more widely than scholars had realized, then many developments in later Jewish and Christian thought might need to be reconsidered. Ideas that had been attributed to rabbinic innovation or Christian inspiration might actually have had sectarian origins. Practices that had seemed uniquely Christian might have had precedents in earlier Jewish sectarian communities. But the most profound impact of the newly available texts wasn't on scholarly theories about ancient history. It was on contemporary understanding of religious faith itself. The scrolls revealed a world where belief was contested, where sacred texts were interpreted in radically different ways, and where sincere believers could reach completely opposite conclusions about God's will. This wasn't the tidy religious world that most modern believers had imagined, where divine truth was clearly revealed and religious authority was unquestioned. It was a messy, complicated world where faith required constant choice, where religious certainty was hard-won, and where the most devout believers were often the harshest critics of religious institutions. The sectarians had been willing to sacrifice everything: family, comfort, security, social acceptance, for their understanding of divine truth. But they had also been willing to acknowledge that their understanding might be incomplete, that revelation was ongoing, and that God's purposes were larger than any human comprehension. Their legacy wasn't a set of doctrines or practices that could be simply adopted by later believers. It was an example of religious seriousness that took both divine transcendence and human responsibility with ultimate gravity. They showed what it looked like to stake everything on faith while remaining intellectually honest about the mysteries that faith couldn't resolve. As scholars continued working through the vast collection of fragments and texts, they began to realize that the real treasure of the Dead Sea Scrolls wasn't any single discovery or revelation. It was the window they provided into a world where religious questions mattered enough to die for, where ancient texts were living documents that spoke to contemporary concerns, and where the search for divine truth was worth any sacrifice. That world had been hidden for nearly 2,000 years, buried in desert caves and locked away in scholarly archives. But now it was speaking again, and its voice was more complex, more challenging, and more relevant than anyone had dared to hope. The shepherds who had thrown stones into dark caves 50 years earlier had unleashed more than ancient manuscripts. They had unleashed ancient voices that still had something urgent to say to a world struggling with the same fundamental questions about faith, truth, and the meaning of existence. And as those voices grew clearer with each newly translated text, each carefully reconstructed fragment, each painstaking scholarly analysis, they began to transform not just academic understanding of the past, but contemporary appreciation of what it means to believe, to doubt, and to search for truth in a world that offers no easy answers. The scrolls were no longer just archaeological artifacts or historical curiosities. They had become teachers, challenging modern believers and skeptics alike to take religious questions as seriously as their ancient authors had, and to approach the mysteries of existence with the same combination of intellectual rigor and spiritual passion that had sustained a desert community through centuries of waiting for a redemption that never came. Or perhaps it had come in ways they never expected, through the very act of preserving their words for generations yet unborn, who would need to hear their ancient wisdom about the eternal human struggle to understand the divine. The battle over the scrolls had been won, but the war over their meaning was just beginning. As scholars around the world finally gained access to the complete collection, they discovered that 40 years of restricted access had created more than just delays in publication. It had created a mythology, a set of expectations and assumptions that would prove harder to dislodge than the monopoly itself. Popular imagination had been fed for decades on hints and rumours about what the scrolls contained. Books had been written claiming they revealed secret teachings of Jesus, hidden gospels that would revolutionise Christianity, or evidence of ancient alien visitations. Documentary films had promised earth-shattering revelations that would shake the foundations of religious faith. The reality, as scholars began to work through the materials systematically, was both more mundane and more profound than the sensational claims suggested. There were no lost gospels, no secret teachings of Jesus, no evidence of extraterrestrial contact. But there was something arguably more significant: a detailed portrait of the religious world that had given birth to both Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity. Dr. John Collins at Yale University found himself in the peculiar position of trying to explain why the scrolls were simultaneously less sensational and more important than popular accounts had suggested. The texts didn't contain bombshell revelations that would overturn 2,000 years of religious tradition, but they did provide unprecedented insight into how that tradition had developed, what alternatives had existed, and why certain paths had been chosen over others. The process of scholarly re-evaluation was complicated by the fact that many of the original team members were still alive and still defending their interpretations. John Strugnell, despite his removal as chief editor, following a controversial interview in which he made disparaging remarks about Judaism, continued to insist that his careful, methodical approach had been vindicated by subsequent research. Other team members took a more conciliatory approach, acknowledging that the delays had been unfortunate while maintaining that their scholarship had been sound. Frank Moore-Cross published a series of articles defending his work on the biblical texts, arguing that his cautious approach had prevented the kind of sensational misinterpretations that were now appearing in popular media. But the damage to their reputations was irreversible. A new generation of scholars had taken over scroll studies, and they brought fresh perspectives, new methodologies, and different priorities. They were less concerned with protecting religious sensibilities and more interested in understanding the scrolls within their ancient context. Dr. Eileen Schuller at McMaster University became one of the leading voices in this new generation of scroll scholars. Her work on the liturgical texts revealed a community that had developed elaborate worship practices, including roles for women that challenged traditional assumptions about ancient Jewish religious life. The Qumran sectarians, it appeared, had included women among those who could offer certain prayers and participate in ritual activities. This wasn't the egalitarian approach that some modern readers might have hoped for, but it was more inclusive than what was practiced in the Jerusalem Temple or in most other Jewish communities of the period. These discoveries about women's roles were particularly significant because they had been largely ignored during the decades when the scrolls were controlled by an exclusively male scholarly team. The original editors had mentioned women's participation in community life only in passing, treating it as a minor detail rather than a significant aspect of sectarian practice. Schuller's work demonstrated how the monopolistic control of the scrolls had shaped not just the pace of publication, but the kinds of questions that were asked and the aspects of ancient life that were considered worthy of study. When access was limited to a small group of male, mostly Christian scholars, certain perspectives and interests naturally dominated the research agenda. The opening of access allowed scholars from different backgrounds to bring different questions to the texts. Jewish scholars could examine the scrolls' relationship to early rabbinic literature. Women scholars could investigate gender roles and family structures. Scholars from non-Western cultures could explore how the sectarians' approach to religious authority might relate to traditions outside the Judeo-Christian framework. This diversification of scholarly perspectives revealed layers of meaning in the scrolls that had been invisible to earlier researchers. The texts weren't just repositories of ancient religious ideas. They were complex social documents that reflected the lived experience of real people struggling with questions that transcended their particular time and place. Dr. Florentino Garcia Martinez at the University of Groningen became one of the most prolific translators of the newly available materials. His work revealed the extraordinary literary sophistication of many sectarian compositions, showing that the Qumran community had produced not just religious texts, but genuine works of art. The Thanksgiving hymns, in particular, demonstrated poetic techniques and theological insights that rivaled anything in biblical literature. These weren't simple prayers of gratitude, but complex meditations on the relationship between divine sovereignty and human freedom, between cosmic justice and individual suffering, between present hardship and future hope. The hymns revealed authors who were deeply learned in biblical tradition, but also creative interpreters who could find new meanings in ancient words. They showed how Scripture functioned not as a closed canon, but as a living tradition that could speak to new situations and address contemporary concerns. This dynamic approach to biblical interpretation provided crucial context for understanding how both Judaism and Christianity had developed their distinctive hermeneutical traditions. The sectarians had pioneered techniques for finding contemporary relevance in ancient texts that would later be adopted and adapted by both Rabbinic Judaism and the early Church. But perhaps the most significant contribution of the newly accessible scrolls was their revelation of the diversity that had characterized ancient Judaism. The standard scholarly model had assumed that there was a mainstream Judaism centered on the Jerusalem temple, with various sectarian groups representing deviations from this norm. The scrolls suggested a different picture. Rather than a single mainstream with peripheral sects, ancient Judaism appeared to have been a collection of competing movements, each claiming to represent the authentic tradition of Israel. The Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and other groups weren't variations on a theme. They were different responses to the fundamental question of what it meant to be faithful to the covenant in a world dominated by foreign powers. This diversity had implications that extended far beyond academic debates about ancient history. It suggested that religious authority had always been contested, that sacred texts had always been subject to interpretation, and that faithful believers had always disagreed about fundamental questions of belief and practice. For modern believers struggling with religious pluralism and the challenge of multiple truth claims, the scrolls offered both comfort and challenge. They showed that diversity of interpretation wasn't a modern problem, but an ancient reality. But they also demonstrated that the ancients had taken these disagreements seriously, viewing them as matters of ultimate significance rather than mere academic exercises. The sectarians hadn't withdrawn to the desert because they were indifferent to the religious debates of their time. They had withdrawn because they believed those debates mattered so much that compromise was impossible. They would rather live in isolation than participate in what they saw as a corrupted religious system. This uncompromising stance raised difficult questions for contemporary believers. How should modern religious communities handle disagreement about fundamental questions? When is separation justified, and when does it become destructive sectarianism? How can diverse interpretations coexist without either sacrificing conviction or descending into relativism? The scrolls didn't provide easy answers to these questions, but they did offer examples of how sincere believers had wrestled with them in the past. The sectarians had chosen separation, but they had also maintained hope for eventual reconciliation. They had rejected the religious establishment of their day, but they had also preserved and transmitted the traditions they claimed to represent. Dr. Moshe Bernstein at Yeshiva University became one of the leading experts on how the sectarians had interpreted biblical texts, and his work revealed sophisticated hermeneutical methods that challenged simple assumptions about ancient reading practices. The Qumran interpreters hadn't just quoted scripture to support predetermined conclusions. They had developed systematic approaches to finding multiple layers of meaning in biblical passages. Their Pesher commentaries, for instance, treated biblical prophecies as encoded references to contemporary events and figures. They believed that ancient prophets had foreseen the circumstances of their own community and had provided guidance for navigating the challenges of the final days. This interpretive approach required enormous learning and creativity. The commentators had to master not just the biblical text, but also contemporary history, sectarian theology, and the complex relationships between different parts of Scripture. They had to find connections that weren't obvious on the surface while maintaining consistency with their overall theological framework. The result was a body of biblical interpretation that was both deeply traditional and startlingly innovative. The commentators claimed to be preserving the original meaning of ancient texts, but they constantly discovered new applications and fresh insights that earlier readers had missed. This tension between tradition and innovation characterized much of sectarian religious life. The community claimed to be following the ancient paths, but they had developed practices and beliefs that differed significantly from what other Jews considered traditional. They insisted they were preserving biblical law, but their legal interpretations were often more stringent than what Scripture explicitly required. This pattern of conservative innovation would later characterize both Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity. Both movements claimed to be faithful to ancient tradition while developing new practices and interpretations that responded to changed circumstances. Both insisted they were preserving the original message while adapting it to new audiences and new challenges. The scrolls provided a window into how this process had worked in one particular community, showing the intellectual and spiritual dynamics that drove religious development in the ancient world. They revealed the creativity that faithful interpretation required and the courage that religious innovation demanded. But they also showed the costs of such uncompromising commitment. The sectarians had preserved their vision of pure faith by separating themselves from the wider world. But that separation had ultimately led to their disappearance. Their texts survived, but their community did not. This tragic outcome raised questions about the relationship between religious purity and social engagement. The sectarians had maintained their theological integrity by avoiding compromise with corrupt institutions, but they had also cut themselves off from the very people they claimed to serve. Their withdrawal had preserved their vision, but limited their influence. The contrast with early Christianity was instructive. The first Christians had also believed they were living in the final days, and had also developed practices that set them apart from mainstream Judaism. But instead of withdrawing from the world, they had engaged with it, spreading their message across cultural and geographical boundaries. The different strategies had led to different outcomes. Christianity had survived and flourished by adapting to diverse contexts and accepting new members, regardless of their background. The Qumran community had preserved its theological purity, but had ultimately vanished from history. These patterns suggested that religious movements faced fundamental choices about how to maintain their identity while engaging with the broader world. Too much adaptation might lead to the loss of distinctive beliefs and practices. Too little might lead to irrelevance and eventual disappearance. The scrolls didn't resolve these tensions, but they illuminated them in ways that remained relevant for contemporary religious communities. They showed how one group had navigated the challenges of remaining faithful in a hostile world, and they revealed both the achievements and the limitations of their approach. As scholars continued working through the vast collection of fragments and texts, they began to appreciate not just the intellectual content of the scrolls, but their emotional power. These weren't just ancient documents. They were the preserved voices of people who had struggled with questions that still troubled believers and skeptics alike. The Thanksgiving hymns, in particular, revealed the inner life of community members who had sacrificed everything for their understanding of divine truth. The authors wrote about moments of doubt and despair, about the challenge of maintaining faith when God seemed absent, about the difficulty of living according to impossible standards. But they also wrote about experiences of transcendence, moments when the divine presence became real and immediate, times when their sacrifices seemed worthwhile and their hope seemed justified. They described a spiritual life that was both demanding and rewarding, both austere and ecstatic. These personal testimonies provided a counterbalance to the legal and theological texts that dominated much of the collection. They showed that sectarian life wasn't just about following rules or maintaining correct beliefs. It was about cultivating a relationship with the divine that could sustain people through the most difficult circumstances. The hymns also revealed the community's deep engagement with biblical tradition. The authors didn't just quote scripture. They absorbed it so thoroughly that biblical language became their natural means of expression. Their prayers were woven together from fragments of psalms, prophetic oracles, and wisdom sayings that had been internalized and transformed through personal experience. This intimate relationship with sacred texts provided a model for how scripture could function as a living tradition rather than a closed canon. The sectarians had found ways to make ancient words speak to contemporary concerns without losing their original power and authority. Their approach suggested that faithful interpretation required not just intellectual analysis, but spiritual engagement. The text had to be lived as well as studied, experienced as well as understood. Only by allowing scripture to shape their entire way of life could interpreters hope to grasp its deeper meanings. This holistic approach to religious texts challenged the academic tendency to separate intellectual and spiritual concerns. The scrolls suggested that the most profound insights into ancient religious literature might come not from detached scholarly analysis, but from committed engagement with the questions and concerns that had motivated the original authors. But such engagement also carried risks. The sectarians' deep identification with biblical tradition had led them to conclusions that other Jews found extreme and divisive. Their spiritual insights had been accompanied by sectarian arrogance and exclusive claims to truth. The scrolls thus provided both inspiration and warning for contemporary readers. They showed the transformative power of serious engagement with ancient religious texts, but they also revealed how such engagement could lead to isolation and self-righteousness, if not balanced by humility and openness to other perspectives. As the 20th century drew to a close, scholars were still working through the implications of discoveries that had been made 50 years earlier. The opening of access had accelerated the pace of research and publication, but it had also revealed the complexity of questions that might never be fully resolved. The scrolls had provided unprecedented insight into the religious world of ancient Palestine, but they had also raised new questions about the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, the development of biblical texts, and the nature of religious authority. They had illuminated one ancient community's approach to faith and practice, but they had also highlighted the diversity and complexity of the world from which both Judaism and Christianity had emerged. Perhaps most significantly, they had demonstrated that the search for religious truth was an ongoing process that required both intellectual rigor and spiritual commitment. The sectarians had devoted their lives to understanding divine will and living according to divine law, but they had also recognized that their understanding was incomplete and their obedience imperfect. Their legacy wasn't a set of final answers, but an example of how to approach ultimate questions with both confidence and humility. They had shown what it meant to take religious truth seriously enough to sacrifice everything for it, while remaining open to new insights and deeper understanding. The scrolls had finally been liberated from their scholarly captivity, but their real liberation came when readers began to engage with them, not just as historical artifacts, but as testimonies to the enduring human search for meaning, purpose, and connection with the divine. In dark caves beside an ancient sea, shepherds had discovered more than old manuscripts. They had uncovered voices from the past that still had urgent things to say to anyone willing to listen carefully to their whispered testimony about faith, doubt, and the courage required to seek truth in a world that offers no easy answers. The scrolls were no longer secrets hidden in academic vaults. They had become teachers, challenging contemporary believers and skeptics alike to approach the mysteries of existence with the same passion and commitment that had sustained a desert community through centuries of waiting for a redemption they believed was always just beyond the horizon. The liberation of the Dead Sea Scrolls marked the end of one chapter in their story, but it was far from the conclusion. As the 21st century dawned, scholars found themselves grappling with questions that went beyond ancient texts and archaeological discoveries. They were confronting the uncomfortable reality that the scrolls controversy had revealed something troubling about the nature of knowledge itself, about who controls access to truth, and about how power operates in the shadows of academic institutions. Dr. Timothy Lim at the University of Edinburgh became one of the most thoughtful voices in examining what the Scrolls affair had revealed about the practice of scholarship itself. In his view, the 40-year monopoly hadn't been the result of a conspiracy or deliberate cover-up. It had been something perhaps more insidious: the gradual accumulation of institutional inertia, personal ego, and unexamined assumptions about scholarly privilege. The original team members hadn't set out to hoard ancient manuscripts or suppress revolutionary discoveries. They had simply assumed that their expertise gave them the right to control access to materials they considered too complex and important for others to handle properly. They had convinced themselves that delays were justified by the need for absolute accuracy, that criticism was motivated by impatience or sensationalism, and that their careful stewardship was protecting the scrolls from misinterpretation. But good intentions hadn't prevented harmful outcomes. The delays had stifled research, frustrated scholars, and created an atmosphere of suspicion that had damaged the reputation of biblical archaeology. More troubling still, the monopolistic system had revealed how easily academic institutions could be manipulated by small groups of insiders who shared common interests and perspectives. The Scrolls controversy had exposed the dark side of peer review, the way that scholarly gatekeepers could suppress inconvenient research by controlling access to materials, funding, and publication opportunities. It had shown how academic prestige could be used to silence critics, and how institutional loyalty could override commitment to open inquiry. These lessons extended far beyond the specific case of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Similar patterns of control and restriction could be found throughout academia, wherever small groups of experts claimed exclusive authority over important materials or research areas. The Scrolls had simply provided the most dramatic example of how such systems could malfunction when left unchecked. Professor Sidney White Crawford at the University of Nebraska began investigating how gender had shaped the entire Scrolls project, from the initial discoveries through the decades of restricted access. Her research revealed that the exclusion of women from the international team hadn't been accidental or incidental. It had reflected deeper assumptions about who was qualified to handle sacred texts and who could be trusted with sensitive religious materials. The all-male composition of the team had inevitably influenced not just the pace of research, but the kinds of questions that were asked and the interpretations that were developed. When scholars examined texts about women's roles in the Qumran community, they had done so from perspectives shaped by their own cultural assumptions about gender and religious authority. This bias had been particularly evident in the treatment of texts that mentioned women's participation in sectarian rituals and community life. Such references had been noted but not explored in depth, treated as curiosities rather than significant evidence about ancient Jewish religious practice. It had taken the arrival of women scholars with different perspectives and priorities to reveal the full significance of these materials. Crawford's work demonstrated how the monopolistic control of the scrolls had created not just delays in publication, but distortions in interpretation. When access was limited to scholars who shared similar backgrounds and assumptions, important aspects of the ancient texts had been overlooked or minimized. The diversity of perspectives that should have enriched scroll studies had been artificially restricted for decades. The opening of access had begun to correct these imbalances, but it had also revealed how much ground had been lost during the years of restricted research. Entire areas of inquiry had been neglected. Promising lines of investigation had been abandoned, and opportunities for breakthrough discoveries had been missed. Meanwhile, technological advances were revolutionizing the study of ancient manuscripts in ways that made the old system of controlled access seem even more obsolete. Digital photography could capture details invisible to the naked eye. Computer analysis could identify patterns and connections across thousands of fragments. Online databases could make materials instantly available to scholars anywhere in the world. The Israel Antiquities Authority, which had inherited responsibility for the scrolls after the 1967 war, began implementing new policies designed to prevent future monopolies. They established deadlines for publication, required regular progress reports from editors, and created mechanisms for reassigning materials when scholars failed to complete their work in reasonable time. But the most significant change was cultural rather than institutional. A new generation of scholars had witnessed the scrolls controversy and drawn lessons about the importance of transparency, collaboration, and open access. They were determined not to repeat the mistakes of their predecessors. Dr. Eibert Tichelaar at KU Leuven became one of the leaders in developing new approaches to collaborative scholarship that could prevent future bottlenecks. His work on creating comprehensive databases of scroll fragments demonstrated how technology could be used to democratize access to ancient materials while maintaining scholarly rigor. Rather than assigning fragments to individual scholars who might sit on them for decades, Tichelaar advocated for collaborative approaches that would make materials immediately available to the entire scholarly community. Experts could contribute their insights without claiming exclusive ownership, and important discoveries could be shared and verified quickly. This collaborative model represented a fundamental shift from the hierarchical approach that had dominated scroll studies for so long. Instead of a small group of gatekeepers controlling access to materials, the new system would rely on the collective expertise of the entire scholarly community to ensure accurate and timely publication. But implementing such changes required overcoming resistance from scholars who had built their careers on the old system of exclusive access. Many senior academics remained skeptical of collaborative approaches, arguing that they would lead to superficial analysis and premature publication of fragmentary materials. The debate reflected deeper tensions within academia about the relationship between expertise and democracy, between careful scholarship and open access. How could institutions maintain high standards while preventing the kind of monopolistic control that had plagued scroll studies? How could they balance the need for expert knowledge with the principle that important discoveries should be shared with the broader community? These questions became even more pressing as other archaeological discoveries began to emerge from the Middle East. New manuscript finds in Afghanistan, Egypt, and other locations raised the possibility that future discoveries might be subject to the same kinds of restrictions that had plagued the scrolls. The lessons learned from the Qumran materials needed to be applied proactively to prevent similar problems from developing. Professor Charlotte Hempel at the University of Birmingham became one of the most vocal advocates for reform in how archaeological materials were managed and studied. Her experience working with the scrolls had convinced her that the old system of individual ownership and exclusive access was not just inefficient, but fundamentally unethical. Ancient manuscripts, Hempel argued, were part of humanity's shared heritage and should be treated as public goods rather than private property. Scholars who worked with such materials should see themselves as custodians rather than owners, responsible for making discoveries available to the broadest possible audience in the shortest possible time. This perspective challenged traditional assumptions about scholarly authority and expertise. It suggested that the value of academic work should be measured not by how long scholars could maintain exclusive access to materials, but by how effectively they could share their discoveries with others. The shift toward more open and collaborative approaches was accelerated by the rise of digital humanities and online scholarship. New technologies made it possible to create virtual research environments where scholars from around the world could work together on the same materials without the geographical and institutional barriers that had limited collaboration in the past. These developments promised to transform not just scroll studies, but the entire field of ancient manuscript research. Future discoveries might be digitized and made available online within months of their discovery, allowing scholars everywhere to contribute to their analysis and interpretation. But technology alone couldn't solve the deeper problems that the scrolls controversy had revealed. The issues of power, ego, and institutional control that had created the original bottlenecks were rooted in human nature and academic culture, not just in the limitations of pre-digital communication systems. Dr. Arstein Justness at the University of Agder began studying the sociology of scroll scholarship, examining how personal relationships, institutional loyalties, and career incentives had shaped the development of the field. His research revealed that the problems with the Scrolls project hadn't been simply the result of individual failings, but of systemic issues that affected many areas of academic research. The pressure to maintain exclusive access to materials, the tendency to hoard discoveries until they could be published in prestigious venues, the reluctance to share preliminary findings with potential competitors. These patterns could be found throughout academia, wherever scholars worked with rare or valuable materials. Justness argued that addressing these problems required more than just new policies or technological solutions. It required a fundamental shift in academic culture, away from the competitive individualism that encouraged scholars to guard their discoveries and toward a more collaborative approach that prioritized the advancement of knowledge over personal advantage. This cultural shift was already beginning to happen in some areas of scholarship, driven partly by the lessons learned from the Scrolls controversy and partly by broader changes in how research was conducted and evaluated. Younger scholars, in particular, seemed more willing to embrace collaborative approaches and open access principles, but resistance remained strong among established scholars who had built successful careers under the old system. They worried that collaborative approaches would diminish the value of expertise and reduce the incentives for the kind of deep, sustained engagement with difficult materials that produce the most significant insights. The tension between these competing visions of scholarship played out in conferences, journals, and academic departments around the world. The Scrolls had become a symbol of both the worst excesses of academic gatekeeping and the potential for more open and democratic approaches to research. As the 50th anniversary of the Scrolls' discovery approached, scholars began to reflect on what the controversy had taught them about the nature of knowledge and the responsibilities of those who claimed to serve it. The lessons were complex and sometimes contradictory, but they pointed toward important questions about how academic institutions should be organized and how scholarly research should be conducted. The Scrolls themselves continued to yield new insights as more scholars gained access to them and new analytical techniques were developed. But perhaps their most important contribution wasn't what they revealed about ancient Judaism or early Christianity. It was what they had taught about the fragility of knowledge, the importance of transparency, and the ongoing struggle to balance expertise with democracy in the pursuit of truth. The shepherds who had thrown stones into dark caves 50 years earlier had unleashed more than ancient manuscripts. They had set in motion a series of events that had challenged fundamental assumptions about how knowledge should be created, controlled, and shared. The Scrolls had become not just archaeological artifacts, but catalysts for broader conversations about power, privilege, and responsibility in academic life. These conversations were far from over. As new discoveries emerged and new technologies developed, scholars would continue to grapple with questions about access, ownership, and the proper balance between expert knowledge and public understanding. The Scrolls had provided a dramatic case study in how these issues could play out, but they hadn't provided simple answers. What they had provided was a reminder that knowledge is never neutral, that the process of scholarship is always shaped by human interests and limitations, and that the pursuit of truth requires constant vigilance against the temptations of power and privilege. The ancient voices preserved in those desert caves had finally broken free from their modern captivity, but their liberation had come at a cost that the scholarly community was still learning to understand. The Dead Sea Scrolls had taught scholars that the most dangerous secrets weren't necessarily the ones hidden in ancient texts. They were the ones embedded in the systems and institutions that claimed to serve the cause of knowledge. Breaking those secrets required not just archaeological discovery, but institutional reform, cultural change, and the courage to challenge established authority in pursuit of a more open and democratic approach to understanding the past. In the end, the scrolls' greatest revelation might not have been what they said about ancient beliefs and practices. It might have been what they revealed about modern scholars and the institutions they served. The ancient sectarians who had preserved these texts in desert caves had been willing to sacrifice everything for their understanding of truth. Their modern custodians had sometimes been willing to sacrifice truth itself for the sake of maintaining their positions and protecting their privileges. The contrast was sobering, but it was also instructive. It reminded scholars that the pursuit of knowledge was not just an intellectual exercise, but a moral commitment that required humility, transparency, and service to something larger than personal ambition. The scrolls had provided a mirror in which the academic community could examine its own practices and principles, and what they had seen there wasn't always flattering. But mirrors could also inspire change. The scrolls controversy had forced scholars to confront uncomfortable truths about their own field and to begin the difficult work of reform. The process was ongoing, and its ultimate success remained uncertain. But the ancient voices from Qumran had at least ensured that these conversations would continue, that future generations of scholars would be challenged to do better than their predecessors had done. The scrolls were no longer captive to human gatekeepers. They had become teachers, not just about ancient Judaism and early Christianity, but about the responsibilities that came with the privilege of studying humanity's most precious intellectual heritage. Their liberation had been long overdue, but it had finally arrived, and with it had come the opportunity for a more open, more collaborative, and more humble approach to understanding the mysteries that connected the ancient world to the present day. The desert caves had kept their secrets for 2 millennia. The scholarly community had kept them for only 40 years more. But those 4 decades had been long enough to teach important lessons about the nature of knowledge, the abuse of power, and the ongoing struggle to serve truth rather than merely claiming to possess it. The scrolls had finally escaped their academic prison, but freedom brought new challenges that no one had anticipated. As scholars around the world dove into the newly accessible materials, they discovered that decades of restricted access had created more than just publication delays. It had fostered a culture of speculation and myth-making that would prove almost impossible to dispel. Popular books had spent 40 years promising earth-shattering revelations hidden in the caves. Documentary films had teased audiences with hints of suppressed gospels and forbidden knowledge. Religious leaders had either dismissed the scrolls as irrelevant or worried privately about what they might contain. The actual texts, complex and fragmentary as they were, could never live up to the sensational expectations that had built up around them. Dr. George Brooke at the University of Manchester found himself constantly battling misconceptions that had taken root during the years of secrecy. Students would arrive in his classes expecting to learn about hidden gospels or secret teachings of Jesus. Instead, they found themselves studying liturgical calendars, purity laws, and fragmentary biblical commentaries that required painstaking analysis to yield their insights. The disconnect between popular expectations and scholarly reality created a new kind of problem. Media outlets that had covered the scrolls controversy extensively suddenly lost interest when the materials proved to contain no smoking guns or revolutionary discoveries. The careful work of translation and interpretation that was finally proceeding at full speed attracted little public attention compared to the sensational speculation that had dominated coverage for decades. This shift in attention had real consequences for scroll scholarship. Funding agencies that had once been eager to support work on these mysterious materials became less generous when the mystery began to evaporate. Publishers who had competed to acquire books about scroll secrets showed less enthusiasm for scholarly monographs on sectarian legal interpretation or calendrical systems. The scrolls had become victims of their own mythology. The very secrecy that had made them famous had also created unrealistic expectations that no ancient documents could possibly fulfill. Scholars found themselves in the peculiar position of having to defend the significance of materials that had once been considered too important to share widely. Professor Jody Magnus at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill became one of the most effective voices in explaining why the scrolls mattered, even without containing revolutionary secrets. Her archaeological work at Qumran had provided crucial context for understanding how the ancient community had actually lived, and she used this evidence to paint a more realistic, but equally fascinating picture of sectarian life. The physical remains at Qumran told a story of dedicated ascetics who had created a thriving community in one of the world's most challenging environments. They had developed sophisticated systems for collecting and storing water, for producing the parchment and ink needed for their extensive copying activities, and for maintaining the ritual purity that their beliefs demanded. These weren't wild-eyed fanatics living in primitive conditions, but organized and disciplined people who had mastered the practical challenges of desert life while pursuing their spiritual goals. They had built workshops for pottery production, established scriptoriums for manuscript copying, and created communal spaces for meals and religious gatherings. The archaeological evidence complemented the textual materials in ways that provided a three-dimensional picture of ancient sectarian life. The scrolls revealed what the community believed and practiced, while the ruins showed how they had organized their daily existence around those beliefs and practices. But even Magnus's careful archaeological work couldn't escape the shadow of conspiracy theories and sensational speculation that had grown up around Qumran during the years of restricted access. Alternative theorists continued to propose that the site had been a fortress, a commercial center, or even a hiding place for treasures from the Jerusalem temple, despite overwhelming evidence for its religious character. The persistence of these alternative theories revealed something troubling about how the long secrecy had affected public understanding of the scrolls. When legitimate scholars had been unable to publish their findings, the field had been left open to speculation and pseudo-scholarship. Theories that would have been quickly refuted by access to the primary sources had been allowed to flourish and gain popular acceptance. Dr. Joan Taylor at King's College London began studying how conspiracy theories about the scrolls had developed and spread during the decades of restricted access. Her research revealed that the void created by scholarly silence had been filled by increasingly elaborate speculations that bore little relationship to what the text actually contained. Some theories claimed that the scrolls contained evidence of Jesus visiting Qumran or even living there for extended periods. Others suggested that John the Baptist had been a member of the community, or that early Christianity had emerged directly from the sectarian movement. Still others proposed that the scrolls contained secret teachings that would revolutionize understanding of both Judaism and Christianity. These theories shared certain common characteristics. They all assumed that the scrolls contained information that was more dramatic and significant than mainstream scholars were willing to admit. They all suggested that academic authorities had reasons for suppressing or downplaying important discoveries, and they all promised to reveal truths that had been hidden from the public for decades. The appeal of such theories was understandable. The long delays in publication had created suspicion about scholars' motives and competence. The obvious importance of the materials made it reasonable to expect significant insights. And the fragmentary nature of many texts left room for creative interpretation that could support almost any theory. But as more materials became available and more scholars gained access to them, the gap between speculation and evidence became increasingly apparent. The scrolls were important, but they were important in ways that required careful study and contextual analysis rather than sensational revelation. Taylor's work showed how the culture of secrecy had damaged not just scholarly research, but public understanding of how historical knowledge was created and validated. When people couldn't evaluate claims about the scrolls by examining the evidence themselves, they had no reliable way to distinguish between legitimate scholarship and creative speculation. The opening of access began to address this problem, but it also revealed how deeply rooted the misconceptions had become. Correcting 40 years of speculation and myth-making would take time and sustained effort from scholars willing to engage with public audiences rather than just academic colleagues. Meanwhile, the actual work of studying the scrolls was proceeding at an unprecedented pace. With access no longer restricted to a small team, dozens of scholars could work simultaneously on different aspects of the collection. Computer databases made it possible to search across thousands of fragments for specific words or phrases. Digital photography revealed details that had been invisible in earlier studies. Dr. Donald Parry at Brigham Young University became one of the pioneers in using computational methods to analyze the scrolls. His work on identifying poetic structures in the texts revealed sophisticated literary techniques that had been used by ancient authors. The sectarians hadn't just preserved and copied existing works. They had created new compositions that demonstrated remarkable artistic skill. These discoveries about the literary quality of sectarian writings helped establish their significance beyond their historical and religious importance. The texts weren't just documents that happened to survive from antiquity. They were works of art that deserve study in their own right. The recognition of the scrolls' literary merit opened new avenues for research that had been largely neglected during the years of restricted access. Scholars could now examine how sectarian authors had adapted biblical language for their own purposes, how they had developed distinctive poetic forms, and how they had used literary techniques to convey theological ideas. This literary approach complemented the historical and religious studies that had dominated earlier scroll scholarship. It provided new ways of understanding how the texts functioned within their ancient context and new appreciation for the creativity and skill of their authors. Professor Maxine Grossman at the University of Maryland became one of the leading voices in advocating for interdisciplinary approaches to scroll studies that could draw on insights from literature, anthropology, sociology, and other fields beyond traditional biblical scholarship. Her work demonstrated how methods developed in other disciplines could illuminate aspects of the scrolls that had been overlooked by purely historical approaches. The interdisciplinary turn in scroll studies reflected broader changes in academic research that emphasized collaboration across traditional disciplinary boundaries. The scrolls provided an ideal case study for such approaches because they touched on so many different areas of inquiry: religion, history, literature, archaeology, linguistics, and even environmental studies. But interdisciplinary work also created new challenges for scholars who had been trained in more specialized approaches. Collaboration required learning to communicate across disciplinary languages and methodologies. It demanded humility about the limitations of any single approach and openness to insights that might challenge established interpretations. The scrolls had always been inherently interdisciplinary materials, but the long period of restricted access had prevented the kind of collaborative work that could have revealed their full significance much earlier. The opening of access finally made such collaboration possible, but it also highlighted how much time had been lost during the decades of monopolistic control. As the 20th century drew to a close, scholars began to assess what had been learned from the scrolls controversy and what lessons it might offer for future archaeological discoveries. The consensus was sobering. The delays in publication had not just frustrated individual researchers, but had damaged the entire field of biblical archaeology. Young scholars had been unable to build careers working with the most important discoveries of their generation. Established researchers had been forced to work with incomplete information that limited their ability to reach sound conclusions. The public had been deprived of access to materials that might have enriched their understanding of ancient religion and history. But perhaps most damaging of all, the controversy had undermined confidence in the scholarly institutions that were supposed to serve the cause of knowledge. If a small group of academics could control access to humanity's heritage for decades without effective oversight, what did that say about the reliability of other scholarly claims and conclusions? Dr. Lawrence Schiffman, who had been one of the most persistent critics of the monopolistic system, reflected on these broader implications in a series of lectures that became influential in shaping academic policy. He argued that the scrolls controversy had revealed fundamental flaws in how scholarly institutions operated and that reform was needed to prevent similar problems in the future. Schiffman's proposals included mandatory publication deadlines for scholars working with archaeological materials, regular review of research progress by independent committees, and automatic reassignment of materials when editors failed to meet their obligations. He also advocated for broader representation on editorial teams and more transparent procedures for selecting scholars to work on important discoveries. These reforms were gradually implemented by various institutions, but resistance remained strong from scholars who had benefited from the old system of exclusive access. The debate over how to balance scholarly expertise with democratic principles continued to shape discussions about archaeological policy and academic governance. The scrolls had become more than ancient manuscripts. They had become symbols of larger questions about knowledge, power, and accountability in academic life. Their liberation from scholarly captivity had been hard won, but it had also opened new conversations about how research should be conducted and how discoveries should be shared. As the new millennium approached, these conversations were far from over. New technologies promised to transform how ancient materials were studied and preserved. New discoveries would test whether the lessons learned from the scrolls controversy had been properly absorbed. And new generations of scholars would face the ongoing challenge of serving the cause of knowledge while resisting the temptations of power and privilege. The ancient sectarians who had hidden their texts in desert caves could never have imagined the journey those manuscripts would take through the modern world. They had preserved their writings for a future they believed would bring divine judgment and redemption. Instead, their texts had survived to witness very human struggles over access, authority, and the proper stewardship of cultural heritage. But perhaps that was fitting. The sectarians themselves had been deeply concerned with questions of authority and legitimacy, with the proper interpretation of ancient texts, and with the responsibilities that came with claiming to possess divine truth. Their modern custodians had faced similar challenges, and their responses had revealed both the nobility and the frailty of human institutions. The scrolls were finally free to speak to anyone willing to listen carefully to their complex testimony about faith, doubt, community, and the search for meaning in an uncertain world. Their liberation had taken longer than it should have, but it had finally arrived, and with it came the opportunity for new conversations between ancient voices and modern listeners. Conversations that might prove more valuable than any of the secrets that had been so carefully guarded for so long. In quiet libraries and research centers around the world, scholars continued the patient work of translation and interpretation that would make those conversations possible. They worked not as guardians of exclusive knowledge, but as servants of a shared human heritage, committed to making the wisdom of the past available to present and future generations. The shepherds who had stumbled upon those first cave scrolls had unleashed something more powerful than they could have imagined. Not just ancient texts, but questions about truth, power, and the responsibilities that came with the privilege of learning from the past. Those questions would continue to challenge scholars and institutions long after the last scroll fragment had been translated and published. The Dead Sea Scrolls had taught the modern world that knowledge belonged not to those who discovered it or controlled access to it, but to all humanity. Their long journey from desert caves to digital databases had been marked by human failings and institutional shortcomings, but it had also demonstrated the power of persistence, criticism, and reform in the service of truth. The ancient voices were speaking again, and this time everyone could hear them. What they had to say about faith, community, and the search for divine truth would continue to resonate as long as humans struggled with the fundamental questions of existence. The scrolls had finally found their proper audience, not a select group of scholarly gatekeepers, but anyone willing to listen to what the past might teach about the present and future. In the end, that may have been the most important discovery of all, that ancient wisdom belonged not in academic vaults, but in the hands and hearts of all who sought to understand the deepest mysteries of human experience. The scrolls had been liberated at last, and with their freedom came new possibilities for learning, understanding, and connection, across the centuries that separated the ancient world from the modern one. The caves had finally given up all their secrets, but the conversations those secrets would inspire were just beginning. The story of the Dead Sea Scrolls is ultimately a story about power, about the human tendency to hoard knowledge, and about the courage required to break systems that serve the few at the expense of the many. As we drift towards sleep tonight, let these ancient voices remind us that truth has a way of emerging from even the deepest caves, even the most carefully guarded archives. The scrolls taught us that knowledge is never truly lost, only hidden, waiting for the right moment to speak again. They showed us that the most dangerous censorship isn't the burning of books, but the quiet decision to keep them locked away, where only a chosen few can hear their whispers. They revealed that sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't made in the field, but in the courage to challenge those who claim exclusive right to interpret what has been found. In those fragments of parchment and papyrus, we see reflected our own struggles with authority, our own questions about who gets to decide what truth looks like, and our own hopes that somewhere, buried beneath layers of institutional control and human ego, authentic voices from the past are still waiting to be heard. The shepherds who threw stones into dark caves in 1947 could never have imagined that their discovery would spark a 50-year battle over the nature of scholarship itself. They were looking for lost goats and found instead a mirror that would force the modern world to examine its own assumptions about knowledge, power, and the responsibilities that come with preserving humanity's heritage. The scrolls are no longer prisoners of academic politics or institutional inertia. They speak now to anyone willing to listen, offering not revolutionary secrets or earth-shattering revelations, but something perhaps more valuable, a window into a world where questions of faith and truth mattered enough to sacrifice everything for, where ancient texts were living documents that spoke to contemporary concerns, where the search for understanding required both intellectual rigor and spiritual courage. Their liberation came not through dramatic revelation, but through persistent pressure, technological innovation, and the gradual recognition that some truths are too important to remain hidden. The bootleg photographs, the leaked fragments, the public campaigns, all were part of a larger movement toward transparency and democratic access to knowledge that would reshape not just scroll studies, but academic research more broadly. But perhaps the most profound lesson of the Dead Sea Scrolls isn't found in their ancient contents at all. It's found in their modern journey from cave to archive to public consciousness. They remind us that the past is never really past, that ancient voices can still speak to contemporary concerns, and that the struggle for truth is ongoing in every generation. The sectarians who preserved these texts in desert caves believed they were living in the final days before divine judgment would transform the world. They were wrong about the timing, but perhaps not about the transformation. Their writings survived to witness changes they could never have imagined. The fall of empires, the rise of new religions, the development of technologies that would make their carefully hidden manuscripts available to anyone with an internet connection. In their patient copying, their meticulous preservation, their willingness to sacrifice comfort and security for the sake of maintaining what they believed to be true, they provided a model for how knowledge should be stewarded, not hoarded by privileged elites, but preserved for future generations who might find in ancient wisdom the guidance they needed for their own struggles. The caves beside the Dead Sea have given up their secrets, but the conversations those secrets inspire continue in libraries and classrooms, in scholarly conferences and online forums, wherever people gather to wrestle with the fundamental questions of human existence. The scrolls have become teachers not just about ancient Judaism or early Christianity, but about the nature of faith itself, about the courage required to seek truth, even when it challenges comfortable assumptions, about the responsibility we all bear for preserving and sharing the wisdom of the past. As you close your eyes tonight, let the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls remind you that truth has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts to control or suppress it. Hidden voices find ways to speak, Locked doors eventually open. Light penetrates even the deepest caves. The shepherds have found their lost sheep, the scholars have released their hoarded treasures, and the ancient voices speak again to anyone willing to listen. In their whispers across 2 millennia, we hear echoes of our own search for meaning, our own struggles with doubt and faith, our own hope that somewhere in the fragments of the past we might find guidance for the future. Sleep well, knowing that truth endures, that knowledge belongs to all humanity, and that even in our darkest caves, voices of wisdom are waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to throw stones into the unknown and listen for what breaks in the silence that follows. The Dead Sea Scrolls have taught us that the most important discoveries aren't always the ones that make headlines. Sometimes they're found in the quiet recognition that knowledge is meant to be shared, that ancient wisdom belongs to everyone, and that the search for truth requires not just scholarly expertise, but moral courage. The caves are empty now, their secrets finally revealed. But the voices that emerge from those hidden chambers will continue to speak as long as humans wonder about their place in the cosmos, their relationship to the divine, and their responsibility to preserve truth for generations yet to come. In the end, the scrolls' greatest revelation may not have been what they said about ancient beliefs and practices, but what they taught about the eternal human struggle between those who would hoard knowledge and those who believe it should be freely shared. The battle for the Dead Sea Scrolls was won by those who understood that some treasures grow more valuable when they're given away, that ancient voices speak most clearly when they're allowed to address the widest possible audience. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember that somewhere in quiet archives and digital databases, scholars continue the patient work of translation and interpretation that makes these ancient conversations possible. They work not as guardians of exclusive secrets, but as servants of shared human heritage, committed to ensuring that the wisdom of the past remains available to present and future generations. The scrolls had taught the world a lesson that extended far beyond the dusty chambers of biblical archaeology. They had shown that transparency isn't just an academic ideal, it's a necessity for truth itself to survive. When knowledge becomes the private property of a chosen few, it begins to wither, not from age or neglect, but from the suffocating grip of those who mistake guardianship for ownership. In university libraries around the world, a new generation of scholars now works with materials that previous generations could only dream of accessing. They approach their research with a humility that their predecessors sometimes lacked, understanding that their role is not to possess ancient wisdom, but to translate it, to bridge the gap between voices separated by millennia, and make those conversations possible for anyone willing to listen. The implications of this shift reach far beyond the study of ancient texts. In laboratories and research centers, in archaeological expeditions and historical investigations, the principles learned from the scrolls' controversy continue to reshape how knowledge is created and shared. The old model of exclusive access and delayed publication is giving way to new approaches that prioritize collaboration over competition, transparency over secrecy. But the scrolls had revealed something even more profound about the nature of truth itself. In their fragments and variations, in their multiple versions of familiar stories, and their evidence of theological diversity, they had shown that certainty is often the enemy of understanding. The ancient world they revealed was not one of monolithic beliefs and unquestioned authorities, but a vibrant ecosystem of competing ideas, passionate debates, and sincere seekers wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. This lesson resonated far beyond academic circles. In a modern world increasingly polarized by claims of absolute truth and exclusive revelation, the scrolls offered a different model, one where truth could be pursued with passion and commitment, while still acknowledging the limitations of human understanding. The sectarians of Qumran had staked everything on their beliefs, but they had also preserved multiple versions of sacred texts, as if recognizing that divine truth might be too large for any single interpretation to contain. The shepherds who first peered into those limestone caves could never have imagined that their discovery would eventually reshape humanity's understanding of how knowledge should be preserved and shared. They were looking for lost animals and found instead a treasure that belonged not to any individual or institution, but to the collective memory of our species. As scholars continue their work with these ancient materials, they do so with an awareness that they are not just studying the past, but participating in an ongoing conversation that stretches across centuries. Every translation, every interpretation, every new insight adds another layer to humanity's understanding of itself, of its spiritual longings, and of its endless search for meaning in an often bewildering universe. The caves beside the Dead Sea are silent now, their ancient guardians long departed. But the voices they preserved continue to speak, offering not answers but better questions, not certainty but the courage to keep seeking, not dogma but the humbling recognition that truth is larger than any human institution's ability to contain it. In the end, the Dead Sea Scrolls remind us that the most important discoveries are often the ones that teach us about ourselves, about our capacity for both wisdom and folly, about our tendency to hoard what should be shared, and about our eternal hope that somewhere in the fragments of the past we might find guidance for the future. The scrolls have finally found their voice, and that voice speaks not of secrets finally revealed, but of the ongoing human conversation about faith, doubt, community, and the endless search for truth. They remind us that knowledge is not a possession to be hoarded, but a gift to be shared. Not a source of power over others, but a bridge that connects us across the centuries to all who have struggled with the same fundamental questions that occupy us still. As we close this chapter of their story, we do so knowing that the conversation they began continues in every library, every classroom, every quiet moment when someone opens an ancient text and discovers that voices from the past still have something urgent to say to the present. The caves have given up their secrets, but the secrets they revealed were not hidden gospels or revolutionary discoveries. They were reminders of truths we had forgotten about the nature of knowledge itself, about the responsibilities that come with learning, and about the courage required to ensure that ancient wisdom remains available to all who seek it. The Dead Sea Scrolls are no longer lost manuscripts. They are found voices speaking across time to anyone willing to listen to their testimony about faith, scholarship, and the eternal human struggle to understand our place in the vastness of existence. Their liberation from academic captivity was long overdue, but it finally arrived, bringing with it the recognition that some treasures grow more valuable the more widely they are shared. Tonight, as you rest, let their story remind you that truth endures, that knowledge belongs to all humanity, and that even in our deepest caves, voices of wisdom are waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to seek them out and generous enough to share what they find. The scrolls are speaking again, and this time everyone can hear them.